So last week we began discussing the different forms of linear equations. And the first one we dealt with was the standard form. And you guys already filled in, I think, all of what I have written here in your notes. It's that little booklet in your notebook. That little booklet is on page 23. So that's the booklet that you're using. And we talked about standard form being ax plus by equals c down here at the bottom on the little tab. And that just simply means that in order to understand if an equation is in standard form, you're going to look for the x and y on the same side. It's the only form of a linear equation that has the x and y on the same side. And then we talked about how when an equation is in standard form, there are two rules that must be followed. Standard form must not include any fractions anywhere. Any term cannot have a coefficient that's a fraction. It doesn't matter if it's only on the y, or if it's only on the x, or if it's the number that's on the right side. It cannot have a fraction. The second rule we learned is that the very first term, which is the x term, the leading coefficient, a, cannot be negative. And so we talked about what to do if either of these two things occur. Okay, so the first thing that you need to know is that if a fraction shows up, and we looked at one example right here, the equation, when I moved the 3/4 x to the left side, it turned out to be 3/4 x plus y equals 7. There's a fraction. So we had to multiply all three terms by 4 in order to get rid of the fractions and leave us with 3x plus 4y equals 28. If the leading coefficient, which is the x term, turns out to be negative, as in this example, when I tried to solve this, I had to move the 2x to the left side by subtracting it. It made the 2x a negative 2x. If I want to get rid of the negative, then I multiply all three of the terms by -1, which is basically just going to have the effect of changing all of the signs. So negative 2x is going to turn to positive 2x. Y is going to turn to negative y, and 3 is going to turn to negative 3. You're allowed to have negatives on all the other terms except for the x term. But the fractions you can't have anywhere. So if any term turns out to have a fraction, that has to be moved. Okay? And then we also talked about one method of graphing. If an equation is given to you in standard form, you can automatically graph it from standard form. And the way that we do that is we find the x and y intercept. So we talked about how to find the x-intercept, you plug in a 0 for y, and to find the y-intercept, you plug in a 0 for x. So all x-intercepts, every point that's on the x-axis is going to have a 0 y value. And every point on the y-axis, which would be a y-intercept, is going to have a 0 for an x. So that's how we identify them. So to find the x-intercept, we plug in a 0 for the y, which in this case is 6y. So we plug in a 0 there, and we get that x equals 6. So it's going to touch the x-axis at 6. And then the y-intercept we are going to find by putting in a 0 for the x. And we found out that y equals 5, so we're going to touch the y-axis at 5. Once we have those 2 points, we can automatically graph the line. Now there is another method that we're going to learn, but we're going to come back to this after we learn slope-intercept form. That's the last form we're going to learn. And that's actually the easiest form. So once we learn slope-intercept, you have a choice as to what you want to do if an equation is presented to you in standard form. You can either find the x and y intercepts and graph it, or once we learn slope-intercept form, you'll convert it to slope-intercept and graph it. So we'll talk about those other forms and about slope next.